The air in the studio was thick, heavy with the scent of damp earth, turpentine, and something else, something new and overwhelmingly human. Dust motes danced in the slanted bars of late autumn sunlight, illuminating a scene that felt both sacred and profane. Julian, no, we can't. The words were a ghost of a protest, a whisper that dissolved against the rough texture of his shirt as her fingers clutched at the fabric. Her voice was a fragile thing, caught somewhere between a plea for him to stop and a prayer for him to never. His hands, those masterful hands that could coax life from cold, unfeeling clay, were now mapping the warm, living curves of her skin, leaving trails of goosebumps in their wake. He lowered his head, his breath hot against the delicate skin of her neck. Isa. He murmured her name like an incantation, a sound that was part worship, part possession. God, Isa, you are exquisite. Her resistance crumbled, melting into a soft, surrendered moan that was lost in the cavernous silence of the room, a silence broken only by their ragged breathing and the frantic beating of two hearts that had no business beating in unison. This was the moment the line was not just crossed, but obliterated, burned away by a heat that had been smoldering for weeks under the guise of art and inspiration. This fire, however, had started as the smallest of sparks in the hallowed, quiet halls of a New England university. He was Julian Vance, a sculptor of considerable renown, a professor whose passion for his craft was matched only by the weariness in his eyes. He had a stable marriage, a respected career, and a soul slowly starving for a new muse. She was Isabella Rossi, a graduate student with eyes that saw the world with a depth that belied her 26 years, her beauty as classical and striking as the art she studied. She was bound to a safe, predictable future with a man who loved her, but did not truly see her. Their paths converged in Julian's studio, a sanctuary of stone and wood, where he sought a model for a new, ambitious sculpture, a piece he hoped would reignite his fading creative flame. From the moment she walked in, bathed in the afternoon light, he knew. He saw not just the perfect lines of a model, but the raw, vibrant life force he had been missing. And she, in turn, saw not just a famous artist, but a man with a profound loneliness that mirrored her own, a man who looked at her and saw everything. The flyer had been unremarkable, a simple piece of paper tacked to a corkboard in the art history department, lost amongst notices for guest lectures and used textbook sales. Artist's model sought, it read, for a major new sculptural work, experience not necessary, but an appreciation for the classical form is essential. It was the name at the bottom that had caught Isabella's eye, Professor Julian Vance. A name that carried weight, a name synonymous with a kind of raw, turbulent talent that had, in recent years, seemed to quiet into a more subdued academic rhythm. Curiosity, more than anything, had propelled her to send the email. And now, she sat across from him in his office, a room that felt like a curated extension of his mind, with towering bookshelves, small bronze studies of hands and torsos on every surface, and the faint, pleasant smell of old paper and stale coffee. Julian watched her, his hands steepled before him. He had seen her photograph, of course, a simple headshot attached to her application, but it had done no justice to the quiet intelligence that radiated from her in person. She wasn't just beautiful, she possessed a stillness, a self-containment that was rare and deeply compelling. He began with the expected questions, his voice a low, gravelly baritone that seemed to absorb the light in the room. He asked about her studies, about her thesis on Bernini, about her own aspirations. Isabella answered with a clarity and passion that took him by surprise. She spoke of the way Bernini captured movement in stone, the way flesh seemed to yield under a phantom touch, the dialogue between agony and ecstasy in the face of Saint Teresa. She wasn't just reciting facts from a textbook, she was articulating a deep, personal connection to the art. Julian found himself leaning forward, his professional facade beginning to crack. He was no longer just interviewing a potential model. He was conversing with a kindred spirit, someone who spoke the silent, emotional language of form that he had begun to fear he was forgetting. He saw a flicker of the same fire in her that had once burned so brightly in him. "You understand, don't you?" he said, the question hanging in the air, more a statement than an inquiry. "You understand that it isn't just about recreating a body, it's about capturing a soul in bronze." Isabella met his gaze, and for a moment the room felt charged, the space between them shrinking. "I think," she said softly, "it's about revealing the soul that was already there." Julian was silent for a long moment. The other candidates he had seen were just bodies, pretty shapes in space. But this woman, she was different. "Come with me," he said, his voice suddenly decisive. "Let's go to the studio. That is where the real conversation must happen." The studio was a world away from the tidy intellectual confines of his office. It was a vast, cavernous space with a ceiling so high it seemed to gather shadows. The air was cool and thick, with the familiar, earthy perfume of clay, plaster, and linseed oil. Sunlight struggled through grime-caked skylights, illuminating giant, ghost-like forms shrouded in white canvas. It was a space of creation, of struggle, of glorious, messy work. It was his church, and he had just invited her into the sanctuary. In the center of the room, on a heavy wooden platform, stood an empty armature, a twisted skeleton of steel wire, waiting for a skin of clay, waiting for a muse. He watched her as she took it all in, her eyes wide with a kind of reverence that soothed a part of him he hadn't realized was aching. She was not intimidated by the scale of the room or the silent, looming figures. She seemed at home. "This is where the work will be done," he explained, his voice softer here. 6 days a week. It requires patience, stillness. He walked slowly around her, his artist's eye taking over, cataloging, analyzing. He was a predator, but his prey was light, shadow, form, the ineffable quality of a human presence. "Please, stand on the platform." Isa stepped onto the modeling stand, the wood solid beneath her simple flat shoes. She felt a strange sense of vulnerability, of being placed on display, yet there was nothing predatory in his gaze now. It was something more intense, more consuming. He looked at her not as a man looks at a woman, but as a sculptor looks at a block of marble, seeing the potential, the finished form hidden within the raw material. "Your posture is excellent," he commented, almost to himself. "A natural contrapposto." He moved closer, the professional distance maintained by a mere foot of air, yet it felt electric. "The way your hair falls, it reveals the line of your neck, your sternocleidomastoid." He gestured, his fingers tracing the shape in the air without touching her. "And your shoulders. There is a wonderful, gentle slope, not athletic, but elegant. It speaks of grace, not force." He continued to circle her, his low voice a constant, hypnotic murmur. "May I?" he asked, his eyes asking permission to get closer still. She gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. He stood behind her, and she felt the warmth of his body near her back. His hand rose, and for a heart-stopping second, she thought he would touch her, but instead, his fingers hovered a mere inch from her skin, tracing the delicate curve of her spine through the thin cotton of her blouse. "This line," he whispered, his voice resonating through her, "from the nape of the neck down. This is where the entire emotion of a figure can be won or lost. It is a line of strength, of vulnerability, of submission, of defiance. Yours is remarkable." Isabella felt a shiver trace the very path his invisible touch had followed. No one had ever seen her like this. Mark, her boyfriend, saw a future wife, a partner. Her professors saw a promising academic. But Julian Vance, he saw the architecture of her being, the poetry written in her bones. She felt utterly exposed, yet completely, profoundly understood. She was no longer just Isabella Rossi, graduate student. She was a line, a curve, a vessel for an idea she could only begin to guess at. She was potential. He moved back to the front, his expression unreadable, a mask of professional concentration. But his eyes, she saw, were blazing. The weariness was gone, replaced by an urgent, terrifying vitality. He had found what he was looking for. "The piece I have in mind," he began, his voice regaining its formal tone, though the underlying intensity remained, "is an exploration of the transition from one state of being to another, a moment of becoming. It requires a profound sense of inner life." He looked directly at her, and the pretense of discussing only art fell away. Even if just for a second. I believe you possess that. The job offer was a formality. The words he spoke about schedules and payment barely registered. What she heard was an invitation. An invitation to step out of her safe, predictable life and into this world of shadow and light, of intense creation and unspoken feelings. An invitation to become art. She heard her own voice accept, calm and clear, a stark contrast to the storm that was beginning to gather inside her. As she left the studio, the heavy door clicking shut behind her, the silence that rushed back in to fill the space felt different to Julian. It was no longer an empty silence. It was a silence that held the echo of her presence, the promise of her return. He walked over to the empty armature, the steel skeleton in the center of the room, and for the first time in years he could see, with absolute terrifying clarity, the figure that was meant to be there. The sessions began with a quiet, unspoken ritual. Isabella would arrive as the afternoon sun began its long, golden descent, her footsteps echoing softly in the empty corridor leading to his studio. She would slip inside, the heavy door closing with a definitive thud that seemed to shut out the rest of the world, leaving them in their own pocket of time. He would have a cup of herbal tea waiting for her, a simple gesture that felt profoundly intimate. While she changed in a small, partitioned-off corner, swapping her student attire of jeans and sweaters for a simple, thin linen robe, he would work his clay, his powerful hands kneading and warming the cold, damp earth, preparing it to receive her likeness. In those first few weeks, the silence was almost absolute, a thick blanket broken only by the rhythmic scrape and slice of his sculpting tools and the whisper of her robe as she took the pose on the platform. The silence was a language in itself. It was respectful, professional, but it was also an empty vessel, and soon it began to fill with an unspoken awareness, a tension that was as palpable as the clay on his hands. Julian's instructions were sparse, his voice low and focused. Turn your head to the left, just a fraction more. Yes, there, hold it. He would work for hours, his eyes narrowed in concentration, darting back and forth between her living form and the burgeoning shape on the armature. His gaze was a physical thing, and Isa could feel it, tracing the curve of her calf, the hollow of her throat, the delicate structure of her wrist. It was a gaze that saw everything, that stripped away all artifice, and in its intensity, it was more invasive, more intimate than any touch. Then, the touches began. They were fleeting, professional, and utterly devastating. To correct the angle of her jaw, his thumb would brace against her chin, his forefinger resting for a heartbeat on the pulse that fluttered at the base of her throat. To adjust the position of her arm, his hands would gently cup her elbow and wrist, his warmth seeping through the thin fabric of her robe, a warmth that seemed to spread through her entire body. Each touch was justified by the demands of the art. He was the artist, she was the form, but a tremor would pass through her, a slight, involuntary shiver that she hoped he didn't notice, though she knew he did. He noticed everything, and for his part, Julian found himself inventing reasons to make these small adjustments. The clay was an imperfect medium, her living form was absolute. He told himself it was about precision, about getting the line exactly right. But he couldn't deny the jolt he felt when his fingers brushed against the unexpected softness of her skin, a softness that haunted him long after she had gone for the day. He started to see the sculpture not as a separate entity, but as an extension of her, and his hands on the clay began to feel like a memory of his hands on her. His language began to change, the clinical, anatomical terms slowly giving way to something more personal, more poetic. What started as the curvature of the lumbar spine became this beautiful, vulnerable arch in your back. What was once the deltoid became the elegant cap of your shoulder, where the light loves to rest. He would murmur these things as he worked, almost under his breath, as if speaking to the sculpture itself, but the words were meant for her. They were offerings, acknowledgments of her beauty that existed in a gray area, safe under the protection of artistic expression. One afternoon, as she held a difficult, reaching pose, a slight strain showing on her face, he stopped working. "Breathe, Isa," he said, his voice gentle. "Don't just hold the pose. Inhabit it. I'm not sculpting a shape. I'm sculpting the feeling of a woman reaching for something she's not sure she can have." His eyes met hers, and in that moment, the entire pretense of their professional relationship fell away. They weren't talking about the sculpture anymore. They were talking about themselves. Isabella felt this shift, this slow magnetic pull, and she responded in ways she didn't fully understand herself. The practical cotton robe she'd worn initially was replaced by one made of a softer, silkier material that clung to her form more readily when she moved. The simple, functional undergarments she wore beneath it became finer, more delicate pieces of lace and silk, a secret she kept for herself, yet it made her feel different on the stand, more aware of her own body, of her own femininity under his watchful gaze. She began to anticipate his needs, making minute adjustments to the pose just before he would ask, showing him that she was not just a passive object, but an active collaborator in this intimate act of creation. She learned to read the subtle shifts in his expression, the tightening of his jaw when he was struggling with a detail, the slight softening of his eyes when he captured a line perfectly. They were building a world together in that studio, a world with its own language, its own rules, its own slowly escalating desires. The air grew thick with all the things they were not saying. Every shared silence, every fleeting glance, every accidental touch was a log thrown onto a fire that was building deep within them. The studio was no longer just a workspace. It had become a pressure cooker of emotion, a crucible where art and desire were being dangerously, beautifully fused together. And as the clay figure on the stand began to look more and more like her, both Julian and Isabella began to wonder who was truly being shaped, the sculpture or themselves. It was a Tuesday in late October, and the sky had been a bruised, heavy gray all day, promising a storm that held its breath until the very last light had bled from the horizon. They had been working for hours, chasing a particularly elusive quality in the sculpture's expression. Isa was holding a pose of quiet contemplation, her body turned away, her head slightly inclined as if listening for a distant sound. The air in the studio was thick with concentration, with the scent of clay and the metallic tang of approaching rain. Then, the first fat drops began to hit the massive skylights, a gentle patter that quickly swelled into a furious drumming roar. A low rumble of thunder shook the old building, and a moment later, a flash of lightning bleached the studio in a stark, instantaneous white, making the shrouded sculptures leap from the shadows like startled ghosts. Isa flinched, breaking the pose, her breath catching in her throat. Julian lowered his tool, a sigh of fatigue escaping him. "I think," he said, his voice sounding tired but warm in the growing dark, "the universe is telling us to stop for the day." He flicked a switch, and a few bare, yellow bulbs cast pools of warm light in the cavernous space, pushing back against the stormy gloom. As Isa reached for her robe, the rain intensified, a torrential, punishing downpour that sounded like a solid wall of water. "You're not going anywhere in that," he stated simply. "Wait it out. I think I have a bottle of wine somewhere in this mess, for emergencies." The emergency, it seemed, was this sudden, forced intimacy, this suspension of their normal routine. He found a dusty bottle of red wine and two mismatched, clay-smudged glasses. He cleared a space on a worn leather sofa tucked in a corner, a piece of furniture that had witnessed decades of his creative struggles. They sat, a cautious distance between them, listening to the symphony of the storm outside. The wine was rich and warming, and it began to loosen the tightly coiled tension that always existed between them. For the first time, they were not artist and muse, not professor and student. They were just two people, trapped by a storm, sharing a bottle of wine in the near dark. The small talk was clumsy at first, comments on the weather, on a university scandal. But the charged silence that fell between their words was more honest. It was Julian who finally breached the unspoken barrier, his voice a low murmur beneath the sound of the rain. "You're quiet today, Isa. Even more so than usual." She swirled the wine in her glass, watching the dark liquid cling to the sides. "I had a conversation with my boyfriend, Mark, last night," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "About the future." Julian waited, sensing this was a door being opened. "He's a good man," she continued, as if needing to state that fact for herself. "He's stable. He has a 5-year plan, a 10-year plan. It involves a house in the suburbs, 2 cars, a golden retriever." She gave a small, humorless laugh. "It's a perfect life. It's the life everyone is supposed to want. But it's not the life you want," Julian finished for her, his voice gentle, not questioning, but affirming. A tear she hadn't realized was forming slipped down her cheek, and she hastily wiped it away. "Is it so wrong to want more?" she asked, her voice cracking with a vulnerability he had never heard before. "Not more things, but more feeling. My life with him feels like a perfectly composed, perfectly lit photograph. It's beautiful to look at, but it's static. It's silent. Then I come here." She trailed off, looking around the beautifully chaotic studio, and this place. This place is loud. It's full of struggle and mess and life. When I'm on that platform and you're working, I feel more real, more alive than I do anywhere else. The confession hung in the air between them, raw and shimmering. She had not only voiced her dissatisfaction with her life, she had named his studio, and by extension, him as its antithesis, as the place where she felt she truly existed. Julian felt something shift inside him, a deep, protective ache. He looked at this brilliant, beautiful young woman on the cusp of a life that would surely suffocate her vibrant spirit, and he recognized her quiet desperation as if it were his own. "My wife Eleanor," he began, the words tasting strange in his mouth. "She is the most intelligent woman I have ever known. We were a perfect match. We still are, on paper. We edit each other's papers, we attend faculty dinners, we can discuss Foucault for hours. Our marriage is a well-respected academic partnership." He took a long swallow of wine, "But I cannot remember the last time she looked at me with anything other than polite, intellectual curiosity. I cannot remember the last time we touched without a reason. A handshake for a grant proposal approved, a pat on the back for a lecture well received." He stared into his glass, as if seeing a reflection of the past 2 decades. The passion, it didn't die in a fire, it just evaporated over years of quiet, reasonable conversations. And the art, my work, it was evaporating with it. It was becoming as polite and passionless as my marriage. He finally lifted his eyes to meet hers, and the look in them was one of utter, unguarded truth. "And then you walked in here, Isa, and you talked about Bernini with a fire in your eyes. And this place, I came back to life." Now it was his confession that filled the space, a mirror to her own. They were the same, 2 souls living lives of quiet containment, starving for a feeling they had almost forgotten existed. The roar of the storm outside seemed to fade, replaced by the roaring in their own ears. The air was thick with their shared secrets, their mirrored loneliness. They were no longer separated by age or position. They were simply 2 people who had, in that moment, seen each other more clearly than anyone else in their lives ever had. Slowly, deliberately, Julian reached across the space separating them on the sofa. He didn't caress her arm or her face. He simply placed his hand over hers where it rested on the worn leather. His hand was large, warm, and rough, with the calluses of his trade. It completely enveloped her smaller, softer one. It was not a gesture of desire, not yet. It was a gesture of profound, earth-shattering acknowledgement. "I see you," the touch said. "I understand." The contact was electric, a silent seal on their unspoken pact. The rain against the windows was the only witness. They had not kissed, they had not embraced, but in the heart of the storm, surrounded by the ghosts of his art, Julian and Isabella had just begun their affair. It was an affair of the soul, and they both knew with a terrifying certainty that it was already far too late to turn back. The days that followed the storm were different. A new, fragile, and dangerous intimacy had been woven into the silence of the studio. The air, which had once been thick with professional concentration, was now heavy with unspoken confessions, with the ghost of a shared vulnerability. Every glance held a double meaning. Every gesture was freighted with the weight of what they now knew about each other. The professional veil they had hidden behind for so long had become frayed and transparent, and the desire it was meant to conceal now pulsed, visible and vibrant, just beneath the surface. Julian found it nearly impossible to focus. When he looked at Isa, he no longer saw just the elegant lines of his muse. He saw the woman who feared a life of beige predictability, the woman who felt more alive in his dusty studio than anywhere else on earth. The knowledge was a brand on his consciousness, and it made his hands tremble as he worked the clay. For Isa, His presence was a constant, low-level hum of awareness. She felt the sadness in him, the deep well of loneliness that mirrored her own, and it created a bond that felt far more real and binding than the comfortable, sexless affection she shared with Mark. Their sessions became a tightrope walk over a canyon of unspoken feelings, a delicate dance of avoidance and magnetic attraction. The breaking point came on a Thursday. The afternoon light was the color of weak tea, and a chill had settled deep into the bones of the old building. Julian was working on the most crucial part of the sculpture, the face. For this, Isa had to be closer than ever, seated on a stool on the platform while he stood inches away, his tools, his hands, his very breath, near her skin. He was trying to capture the subtle, complex expression they had agreed upon, a look of longing, of hope, tinged with a deep, knowing sadness. To do this, he had to study her face with an unnerving intensity. His gaze traced the bow of her lips, the faint shadows beneath her cheekbones, the almost imperceptible flutter of her eyelashes. He saw the tiny fleck of gold in the iris of her left eye. He memorized the precise way a single strand of dark hair fell across her temple. They were so close she could smell the earthy scent of the clay on his fingers, the faint, masculine scent of his skin. The silence was absolute. The only sound was the soft, wet scrape of a wooden tool shaping the likeness of her mouth. Her heart was a frantic drum against her ribs. She felt pinned by his gaze, mesmerized. She had to fight every impulse in her body to lean forward, to close the torturous distance between their faces. Julian was in his own private hell. He was trying to channel this overwhelming torrent of feeling for the woman before him into the cold, dead clay, but it was like trying to capture lightning in a bottle. Every detail he observed, every nuance of her expression, was not just data for his art. It was a fresh wound of desire. He wanted to touch the smooth skin of her cheek, not to measure a contour, but to feel its warmth. He wanted to trace the line of her lips with his finger, not to replicate them, but to know their softness. His professionalism, the discipline of a lifetime, was the only thing holding him back, a dam with 1,000 cracks about to burst. "Okay," he finally whispered, his voice hoarse. "That's enough for today." The words broke the spell. Isa blinked, letting out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Her muscles ached from the stillness. She felt dizzy, disoriented, as if waking from a trance. She stood and turned, her back to him, reaching for the silk robe she had left draped over a chair. Her hands were shaking slightly as she fumbled with the fabric. Behind her, Julian stood frozen, watching her. He saw the vulnerability in the nape of her neck, the delicate vertebrae of her spine visible as she leaned forward. The discipline, the dam, it just broke. He took 2 silent steps forward, his body moving on an impulse far older and more powerful than reason. As she lifted the robe, he was there. "Let me," he said, his voice a low vibration that seemed to travel straight through her bones. She stopped, her hands falling to her sides. He took the soft fabric from her, his fingers brushing against hers, sending a shockwave up her arm. He gently draped the robe over her, his movements slow, achingly deliberate. As he settled the silk onto her shoulders, his hands did not retreat. They rested there, his palms and fingers spread wide, a definite, possessive weight on her bare skin. It was not a professional touch. It was not an accidental graze. It was a claim. Isa's breath hitched. The world seemed to stop turning. She could feel the heat of his hands, the slight roughness of his calloused fingertips against her smooth skin. This was it. The moment she had been both dreading and craving for weeks. She could pull away, end this now, run back to her safe, beige life. Or she could stay. She did not move. Instead, in a gesture of complete and utter surrender, she let her head fall back slightly, her neck arching, a silent invitation. That was all he needed. He tightened his grip on her shoulders, slowly turning her around to face him. Her eyes were wide, dark pools of fear and anticipation. He looked at her, truly looked at her, and she saw in his gaze all the desperate loneliness, all the banked hunger he had confessed to her during the storm. He lifted one hand from her shoulder and gently cupped her jaw, his thumbs stroking her cheek. "Isa," he breathed, and her name was both a question and a prayer. He lowered his head, and the first touch of their lips was incredibly soft, hesitant. It was a whisper of a kiss, a tentative exploration, freighted with the colossal weight of their betrayals, of the lives they were setting on fire with this single, gentle contact. For a heartbeat, it was just that, a moment of quiet, fearful connection. But then, a low sound, a whimper of need, escaped from Isa's throat, and it was like throwing gasoline on a dying ember. The hesitation was consumed by a sudden, ravenous fire. The kiss deepened, becoming hungry, desperate, a release of all the tension that had been coiling between them for months. It was a kiss of profound, soul-deep recognition. His other arm wrapped around her waist, pulling her flush against him, and she could feel the hard planes of his body, the frantic beating of his heart against her own. She wasn't a sculpture anymore. She was flesh and blood and heat in his arms. Her hands came up, tangling in his thick, unruly hair, pulling him closer. It was a kiss of desperation, of starvation, a raw and clumsy collision of two people who had been starving for something real. When they finally broke apart, gasping for air, they didn't move. They rested their foreheads together, eyes closed, breathing each other's breath. The studio was silent once more, but this was a new silence. It was not empty. It was filled with the deafening roar of a line that had been crossed, a point of no return. There were no words to say. There was nothing left to say. There was only the terrifying, exhilarating, and ruinous beginning of what came next. The kiss ended, but the space between them remained charged, a vacuum where the world and all its rules ceased to exist. They stood with their foreheads pressed together, gasping, their breath mingling in the cool studio air. In Julian's eyes, Isa saw the reflection of her own terrified exhilaration. In hers, he saw a surrender so complete it made his soul ache. The moment stretched, suspended in silence, a fragile bubble of impossibility. This was the precipice. They could step back, apologize, pretend it was a moment of madness, and spend the rest of their lives haunted by the ghost of what almost was, or they could fall. It was Julian who made the choice. He lifted his head, his gaze searingly intense, and with a low groan that seemed torn from the depths of his being, he crushed his mouth to hers again. This second kiss was different. There was no hesitation, no question. It was a conscious, deliberate claiming, a final, irrevocable step off the edge. All the artistry, all the intellectual connection, all the smoldering subtext of the past few months was consumed by a raw, desperate physical hunger. His hands slid from her face, down her neck, and tangled in the silk of her robe, pulling her body flush against his. He was all hard angles and surprising strength, and she melted against him, a yielding softness that seemed to invite his possession. Her own hands, which had been frozen at her sides, now acted with a mind of their own, sliding up his chest, her fingers fumbling with the thick, stiff buttons of his chambray work shirt. The simple task felt monumental, her fingers clumsy with haste and a tremor she couldn't control. One button came free, then another, exposing the warm, hard plane of his chest. Meanwhile, his own hands were working at the simple tie of her robe, his movements equally urgent, equally uncoordinated. The knot wouldn't give, and a frustrated sound escaped his throat. With a final, impatient tug, the silk loosened and whispered from her shoulders, pooling in a soft heap at her feet. She stood before him in the dim yellow light, wearing nothing but a delicate, transparent piece of black lace that did little to conceal the swell of her full, round breasts, the nipples hard from the chill in the air, and the fire of his gaze. "God, Isa," he breathed, his eyes devouring her. He looked at her as if he were a man dying of thirst, and she was the first drop of water he had seen in a lifetime. His sculptor's hands, which knew the secrets of form and shadow, finally found their truest medium. He reached out, not with a fumbling grasp, but with a reverent touch, his fingertips tracing the delicate edge of the lace, circling the curve of her breast before his palm settled over her heart. He could feel its frantic, bird-like beat against his skin. "Julian," she whispered, a fragile, breaking sound. "We shouldn't. This island." The words died on her lips as his other hand came to her back, his fingers splaying across her bare skin, pulling her closer still until the thin lace was the only thing separating their bodies. He lowered his head, his lips finding the sensitive hollow of her throat. A shiver racked her body. "It's too late for shouldn't," he murmured against her skin, his voice a gravelly rumble of pure want. "It's been too late for a very long time." With a final, deft movement, he unhooked the clasp of her bra, and the lace fell away. His gaze was full of a raw, aching worship as he looked at her, truly seeing her for the first time, unveiled and vulnerable in the sanctuary of his art. He bent his head, and his mouth closed over her, and any remaining thought of protest, any lingering whisper of guilt, was incinerated in a blinding flash of pure sensation. A sound was torn from her, half gasp, half sob, and her hands clenched in his now open shirt, holding on as if he were the only solid thing in a collapsing world. He lifted her then, as easily as if she were one of his smaller maquettes, and carried her the few steps to the center of the studio, where a vast clay-dusted canvas tarp was spread across the floor. He laid her down gently on the rough, cool fabric, the texture a startling contrast to her heated skin. The dim light from the single bulb overhead cast long, dancing shadows, making the silent, half-finished statues surrounding them seem like ancient, solemn witnesses to a forbidden rite. He stood over her for a moment, his chest rising and falling heavily, his face a mask of agonizing need. Then he was shedding his own clothes, the shirt, the worn trousers, until he was as exposed as she was. He came down to her, his body covering hers, and the first full contact of their skin, warm and alive, was a shock, a homecoming, a transgression so profound it felt holy. "Isa, look at me," he commanded, his voice thick. She opened her eyes, locking her gaze with his. There were no more secrets, no more veils. There was only this, the raw, terrifying truth of their desire. As he moved to enter her, she instinctively flinched, a final, fleeting instinct of self-preservation. "Julian." Please, wait," she gasped, a last, desperate appeal to a reason that had long since fled. He paused, his body taut with control, his eyes searching hers. "Tell me to stop," he rasped. "Say the word, and I will stop." She looked at him, at the agony and the worship in his face, and she knew she couldn't say it. She would rather be ruined than say it. With a soft, shuddering sigh of surrender, she shook her head, her hands coming up to cup his face, her thumbs stroking the rough stubble on his jaw, and she pulled him down to her. The world dissolved into pure sensation. It was a frantic, desperate coupling, a collision of two lonely bodies seeking solace, seeking oblivion. It was the earthy smell of the dusty canvas, the coolness of the floor beneath her back, the heat of his skin, the scrape of his stubble against her cheek. It was the guttural moans that escaped his lips, the high, keening sounds she didn't recognize as her own. It was her name, spoken over and over like a prayer. Isa. God, Isa. It was his name, a desperate anchor in a raging sea. Julian. Oh, Julian. It was messy and graceless and utterly, perfectly real. It was a release of a pressure that had been building for months, a violent, beautiful, and heartbreaking exorcism of longing. In the end, they collapsed together, spent and shuddering, their bodies slick with sweat, their harsh, ragged breaths the only sound in the vast, silent studio. They lay entangled on the dusty canvas, two people adrift, surrounded by the cold, enduring art that had brought them to this ruinous, ecstatic moment. The silence that followed was heavier than any they had ever shared before, filled with the deafening, unspoken truth of what they had just done. The drive home that night was a silent, solitary journey through a world that had been irrevocably altered. For Isabella, the familiar streetlights of her quiet suburban neighborhood seemed alien, intrusive, the glow of her own headlights, a confession sweeping across the manicured lawns of sleeping houses. She parked the car in the driveway and sat for a long time in the darkness, the scent of him of clay and turpentine, and his skin still clinging to her clothes, a phantom presence in the sterile space. The key in the front door felt heavier, the silence in the house she shared with Mark no longer peaceful but hollow. He was asleep, a fact for which she was profoundly grateful. She slipped into bed beside his warm, oblivious body, and as she lay there, staring at the ceiling, the memory of Julian's hands, his mouth, his weight, played itself over and over in her mind. It was a terrifying, exhilarating loop, a brand of sensation seared into her skin. Guilt was a cold stone in her stomach, but beneath it, a strange, wild heat spread through her veins. It was the feeling of having a secret so monumental it had its own gravity, a secret that was hers and Julian's alone. Across town, Julian stood under a scalding hot shower, scrubbing at his skin as if he could wash away the scent of her, the feel of her, the crime of her. But it was useless. When he walked into the bedroom, Eleanor was awake, reading under a small, precise beam of light. "You're late," she said, her voice neutral, not accusatory, just a statement of fact. "I lost track of time," he replied, the lie tasting like ash in his mouth. The face, "It's giving me trouble." It was the first of 1,000 lies, small and large, that would begin to build a wall between his two worlds. Eleanor simply nodded, turning a page. And in that simple, dismissive gesture, he felt both a pang of guilt and a wave of profound, liberating relief. Their secret life began not with a whisper, but with the sterile chime of a text message the next afternoon. "I left a book in the studio. Can we discuss a passage this evening?" Julian's heart hammered against his ribs as he read the words. It was a perfect code, academic and innocuous, but the subtext screamed from the screen. His fingers, usually so steady, trembled as he typed his reply. "Of course. The studio will be open until 9. I'm glazing a few pieces." Glazing. A new word in their private lexicon. A word that now meant heat and risk, and the frantic, desperate coming together of their bodies. The studio, once their sanctuary of art, became their cathedral of sin. The work continued, the sculpture growing under his hands, but now it was all a prelude, a long, agonizingly slow foreplay. The air was no longer just tense. It was electric with memory and anticipation. Their eyes would meet over the growing clay figure of her, and in a single glance, they would relive every touch, every taste, every sound. The sessions would end, the heavy door would be locked, and they would fall on each other with a desperate, frantic energy, a stark contrast to the slow, almost reverent discovery of their first time. Their encounters in the studio were now fueled by the thrill of the forbidden, the constant, low-level fear of a knock on the door, of a colleague working late. It made every touch sharper, every kiss deeper, every moment more precious and more dangerous. But the confines of the studio, once a world unto itself, soon began to feel too small for the magnitude of their secret. They needed to see if it could survive in the light of day. Their first rendezvous in the outside world was a masterpiece of calculated risk. A small, independent cinema in a town 30 miles away, a place where no one would know their faces. They arrived in separate cars and sat in the back row with a careful, empty seat between them. In the flickering darkness, surrounded by strangers, Julian was acutely, painfully aware of her presence. He could feel the warmth radiating from her body. He could smell the faint, clean scent of her shampoo. He didn't dare look at her, instead staring at the screen, the plot of the film a meaningless blur. Halfway through, as she reached for the cup of soda they were ostensibly sharing, her fingers brushed against his. The contact was fleeting, accidental, and it sent a jolt through him so powerful he was surprised he didn't cry out. It was a touch that meant nothing and everything, a tiny, secret spark in the anonymous dark. After the movie, they walked for a few minutes in a nearby park, the autumn leaves crunching under their feet. They talked about the film, about their work, about anything and everything except what they were actually doing. It was a strange, thrilling performance of normalcy, two people pretending to be acquaintances while their souls were screaming with the intimacy they shared. As they parted at their cars, he allowed himself a single brief touch, his hand on the small of her back. "Be safe," he said, and the simple words were a universe of meaning. "I love you, I want you, I am terrified for us." The secret became an intoxicating drug. It made the world sharper, colors brighter, his own senses more acute. Julian started to see Isabella everywhere, even when she wasn't there. But when he did see her, walking across the university quad, her dark hair a stark banner against the muted tones of the old stone buildings, his breath would catch in his chest. His artist's eye, once focused on the classical purity of her form, was now utterly corrupted by a lover's hunger. He would watch the way her simple cashmere sweater clung to the full, round curve of her breasts, and he would remember, with a visceral, gut-punching clarity, their weight and softness in his hands. He would follow the gentle, hypnotic sway of her hips as she walked away, and his mind would be filled with the memory of that same rhythm in the darkness of his studio. He was obsessed, possessed by a desire that was as much about memory as it was about the present moment. For Isa, the affair was a constant, dizzying hum beneath the surface of her mundane life. Every mundane question from Mark, "How was your day?" became a minefield. Every lie she told was a small, sharp thrill, a confirmation of the secret, vibrant world she inhabited that he knew nothing about. The guilt was a constant companion, a cold shadow that fell over her at unexpected times. But the exhilaration, the feeling of being truly, deeply seen and desired by Julian, was a sun that burned the shadow away, at least for a little while. They were suspended in a state of beautiful, terrifying grace, two people living on a razor's edge between ecstasy and ruin. The secret was their bond, their world, their private language. It was a heady, addictive poison, and they drank it down, day after day, telling themselves it was the only thing that made them feel alive. The frantic, stolen moments in the studio, while intoxicating, had begun to carry a new, sharper edge of terror. The thrill of being caught was giving way to the very real, sickening fear of it. There was the evening. A janitor had rattled the locked door with his key, his muttering audible from the other side, a sound that had made their hearts seize in their chests. There was the afternoon. A graduate student had knocked, her cheerful voice calling out Julian's name, forcing them to stay frozen in a silent, compromising embrace for 3 agonizing minutes until her footsteps finally receded. The studio, their sanctuary, was becoming a cage lined with tripwires. The risk was no longer a spice. It was a poison, and they both knew they needed a new place. A place that was utterly anonymous, a place that belonged to no one. A place without ghosts, without art, without the possibility of an insistent knock on the door, a place built for secrets. He chose a motel on a forgotten highway 20 miles out of town, a low-slung building with a flickering neon sign that promised color television and vacancy. The name itself, the Starlight Motor Inn, was a sad, cosmic joke under the starless, overcast sky. The room Julian paid for in cash smelled faintly of bleach, stale cigarette smoke, and a profound, lingering loneliness. The bedspread was a garish geometric pattern of browns and oranges, the carpet was thin, and the single painting on the wall was a faded, generic seascape. There was no beauty here, no history, no art. There was only a bed, 4 walls, and a lock on the door. It was perfect. When Isa arrived 10 minutes after him, slipping out of her car and quickly into the room, the reality of the place seemed to land on them with a physical weight. They stood in the middle of the room, under the buzzing fluorescent light of the small vanity, suddenly awkward, suddenly stripped of their familiar roles. He was not the great artist in his sanctum. She was not the ethereal muse on her pedestal. They were a man and a woman, far from their homes, about to commit a deliberate act of betrayal in a cheap, transient room. The sordidness of it was a cold, clarifying slap in the face. Isa hugged herself, rubbing her arms as if chilled. She started, unable to find the right word. "It is what it is," Julian finished, his voice a low, rough thing. "It's safe. It's ours. For an hour." He closed the distance between them, but he didn't kiss her. Instead, he reached out and took her hands, his grip firm, grounding. "Look at me," he commanded softly. She lifted her gaze from the ugly carpet to his face, and the awkwardness, the sordidness, it all just vanished, burned away by the sheer, unadulterated hunger in his eyes. This was different from the frantic, desperate passion of their first time. This was a slow, deliberate burn. This was intentional. "I've thought of nothing else," he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "Since the last time. I see you when I close my eyes. I feel your skin when I'm working the clay. I had to have you, away from all of that. Away from everything. Just you." His words were a confession and a promise. He released one of her hands and brought his own up to her face, his thumb tracing the delicate line of her jaw. Then, with an agonizing slowness, he began to unbutton her coat, his eyes never leaving hers, watching her reaction, watching her breath catch. The frantic fumbling of their first encounter was gone, replaced by a slow, possessive ritual. He slid the coat from her shoulders and let it fall to the floor. Then he moved to the buttons of her blouse, his fingers sure and steady. He wasn't just undressing her, he was unwrapping her, savoring every moment, every inch of newly exposed skin. When her blouse was open, he didn't remove it. He simply pushed it back, letting it frame her shoulders, his gaze dropping to the simple, pretty bra she wore. His hands went to her waist, his palms hot against her skin, and he slowly, deliberately, began to push her jeans down over the curve of her hips. The rasp of the zipper was the only sound in the room, loud and profane. "Tell me you want this, Isa," he rasped, his hands now resting on the swell of her hips. "I need to hear you say it." She was trembling, caught in the tractor beam of his intent. The last of her resistance, the last vestiges of who she was outside of this room, crumbled to dust. "I want this," she whispered, her voice shaky but clear. "Julian, I want you." The words were a key turning in a lock. A new permission was granted. "Good," he said, a dark satisfaction in his tone. He bent his head and kissed her then, a deep, soul-stealing kiss that was no longer about discovery but about possession. It tasted of need, of obsession, of a darkness they were now willingly stepping into together. The lovemaking that followed was a descent. It was no longer a frantic, almost accidental collision, but a slow, deliberate exploration of a shared abyss. He laid her on the cheap, synthetic bedspread and took his time, learning her body not with the reverence of an artist, but with the focused hunger of a lover. The sounds in the room were raw, intimate, the whisper of skin on sheets, the sharp intake of their breaths, the low, guttural moans that came from him, the soft, pleading cries that came from her. Their dialogue was no longer just names gasped in the heat of the moment. It was a litany of whispered needs. "Touch me here," she would plead, guiding his hand. "Don't stop," he would command, his voice thick with pleasure. "Isa, tell me what you like. Tell me what you want me to do to you." And she would tell him, her words shocking her own ears, a litany of desires she never knew she possessed until he gave her the language to speak them. It was a raw, primal rhythm, a complete loss of control that was, paradoxically, born from a place of utter, deliberate intent. They were not being swept away, they were choosing to drown. In the aftermath, they lay tangled in the cheap sheets, the air thick with the smell of their sweat and sex. The silence that fell was different from the silence in the studio. There was no art to hide behind, no beauty to ennoble what they had done. There was only the hum of the mini-fridge and the harsh reality of the ugly room. They were just two adulterers in a motel, and the profound intimacy of the act gave way to a cold, creeping emptiness. They dressed in near silence, the spell broken. The room, which had briefly been their private world, now felt like a crime scene. As Isa slipped out the door and back to her car, the thrill of their shared secret was gone, replaced by the chilling realization that this was no longer a beautiful, tragic mistake. It was a habit. It was a need. It was an abyss, and they were falling deeper and deeper with every deliberate step. The intoxicating haze of their secret, once a warm and protective cocoon, began to thin, becoming a cold, anxious fog. The world they had so carefully shut out started to press in on them, its sharp, unwelcome corners puncturing their fragile bubble. The lies, which had once felt like a thrilling, secret language, now felt like a foreign tongue they were forced to speak, clumsy and exhausting. The cracks in the facade began to appear, not as a single dramatic shatter, but as a series of fine, hairline fractures that threatened the integrity of their entire lives. For Julian, the intrusion began in the quiet, domestic spaces he shared with Eleanor. She was not a woman prone to dramatic confrontations. Her intelligence was a quieter, more precise instrument. One evening, as they sat in their respective armchairs, the only sounds, the rustle of pages, and the ticking of a grandfather clock, she looked at him over the rim of her reading glasses. "You've taken to wearing your studio clothes home quite often," she observed, her tone deceptively casual. "The scent of clay is rather permanent these days." Julian's heart gave a painful lurch. He had been careless. He mumbled something about working with a new, messier type of plaster, about being too tired to change. Eleanor didn't challenge him. She simply held his gaze for a moment longer than necessary, a look of calm, dispassionate analysis in her eyes, the same look she gave to a historical document she suspected of being a forgery. In that look, He understood that she knew something was wrong. She didn't know what, not yet, but she was watching. The knowledge sat like a stone in his gut. His home, once a place of comfortable, if passionless, routine, now felt like an interrogation room where he was the only suspect. For Isabella, the pressure came from a different, more emotional direction. Mark's 5-year plan did not account for the sudden, inexplicable distance of the woman at its center. He was not a subtle man. His concern was as direct and solid as his ambitions. He tried to bridge the gap he felt growing between them, but his every attempt was a painful reminder of her betrayal. One Sunday morning, as she stared blankly into a cup of coffee, he came up behind her and wrapped his arms around her waist, resting his chin on her shoulder. "Hey," he said softly, "you seem a million miles away." A year ago, she would have leaned back into his embrace. Now, her body went rigid, an involuntary, defensive, stiffening. It was a minuscule reaction, but he felt it. He loosened his grip, a wounded look on his face. "What is it? Are you unhappy? Is it me?" The genuine hurt in his voice was a knife in her conscience. "No, of course not," she lied, the words feeling like sandpaper in her throat. "It's just this project. It's consuming." He wanted to understand, but he couldn't. He looked at her with a desperate incomprehension, like a man trying to read a book in a language he'd never learned. She saw then that her secret life with Julian had not just been built on lies. It was being paid for with the currency of Mark's love and trust. A currency she was draining with every stolen hour, every coded text, every remembered touch that was not his. The paranoia began to set in, a low-grade fever that colored their entire existence. Every ringing phone was a potential exposure. Every familiar face seen across the university campus was a potential witness. They began to see accusation in neutral glances, suspicion in innocent questions. The world, which had once been the backdrop to their vibrant secret life, had transformed into a hostile landscape, full of eyes and ears. The exhilaration of the secret was being steadily replaced by the grinding, nerve-shredding exhaustion of maintaining it. The escape was beginning to feel like a cage. The most terrifying crack appeared on a cold, rainy afternoon in the one place they still considered safe. The studio. The sculpture was nearly finished, a breathtaking bronze testament to their passion and their folly. They were not making love, but were caught in a moment of quiet, desperate intimacy, a stolen kiss against a plaster-dusted wall, his hands tangled in her hair, her body pressed against his. It was a moment of reassurance, a silent promise that their secret world was still real, still worth the cost. And then they heard it. Footsteps in the corridor, quick and purposeful, stopping directly outside their door. "Julian, are you in there?" The voice was cheerful, booming, and utterly unmistakable. It was Professor Albright from the history department, a man whose defining characteristic was a relentless, unstoppable chattiness. Panic, cold and absolute, seized them. They sprang apart, their eyes wide, with a shared, primal terror. The doorknob rattled. It was locked. "Julian, I know you're in there. Your car's in the lot." "I have that book you wanted on Rodin's casting techniques," Albright called, his voice muffled but persistent. "Just a second," Julian croaked, his voice an octave too high. He looked at Isa, his face pale, his mind racing. There was nowhere for her to go. He shoved her, none too gently, behind a massive, freestanding canvas that leaned against the far wall. "Don't move. Don't breathe," he hissed, his own breath coming in ragged, shallow bursts. He took a precious 2 seconds to run his hands through his disheveled hair, to straighten his shirt, to compose his features into a mask of weary academic focus. He wiped the smudge of her lipstick from his mouth with the back of his hand. Then, with a heart that felt like it was trying to batter its way out of his chest, he unlocked and opened the door a crack. "Albright," he said, forcing a weary smile. "Sorry, I was in the zone." "You know how at Island Albright beamed, oblivious, holding up the book. I know. When the Muse strikes. But I wanted to catch you before you left." For the next 5 minutes, an eternity, Albright stood in the doorway and talked and talked and talked. He spoke of Rodin, of a tedious faculty meeting, of his daughter's college applications, and Julian stood there, nodding, smiling, making the appropriate responses, a cold sweat trickling down his back. His entire being was focused on the space behind the canvas, where Isabella stood, silent and terrified, mere feet away from their complete and utter ruin. He could feel her presence, her fear, as if it were a physical force in the room. Finally, with a last booming laugh, Albright handed him the book and departed. Julian shut the door, locked it, and leaned his forehead against the cool, solid wood, his body trembling with the aftermath of adrenaline. The silence that filled the studio was deafening. He turned to see Isa stepping out from behind the canvas, her face ashen, her arms wrapped tightly around herself. They stared at each other for a long moment, the magnitude of their near disaster settling upon them like a shroud. He moved to her, and they clung to each other, but it was not an embrace of passion. It was the desperate, fearful clutch of two people who had just looked over the edge of a cliff and seen the rocks below. The studio was no longer their sanctuary, it was a trap. And as Isa left that night, pulling her coat tight against the rain, she looked up and down the empty corridor, not with anticipation, but with the hunted, furtive glance of a fugitive. The beautiful escape had become a prison of their own making, and the walls were closing in. The near disaster with Professor Albright was a catalyst, a harsh chemical agent that clarified the murky, intoxicating brew of their affair into something sharp and poisonous. The thrill was gone, boiled away by a terror so profound it left them shaky and hollowed out. The beautiful escape had become a source of constant, gnawing anxiety, and the unspoken questions that had lurked in the shadows between them now crawled out into the harsh, unforgiving light. The change in Isabella was palpable. The soft, yielding surrender in her eyes was replaced by a haunted, restless energy. The lies she told Mark were becoming heavier, the double life she was leading, more draining. The fear of being caught was now eclipsed by a new, more terrifying fear that this immense, life-altering risk was all for nothing. She needed to know what this was, what they were. She confronted him not with anger, but with a quiet, desperate intensity one evening in the studio. The sculpture of her stood nearly complete between them, a silent, bronze doppelganger whose serene expression was a cruel mockery of her own inner turmoil. "Julian," she began, her voice low and steady, refusing to let it tremble. "We can't keep doing this." He flinched, mistaking her words for an ending. "Isa, what happened with Albright was a fluke. We'll be more careful." She cut him off, shaking her head. "This isn't about being careful. This is about this. All of this. The lies, the motels, the hiding in your studio like a guilty secret. I feel like I'm holding my breath all the time, and I don't know when I'll be able to breathe again." He moved towards her, his instinct to soothe her with touch, with the physical connection that had always been their answer. "I know it's hard," he murmured, reaching for her. But for the first time, she stepped back, denying him. The rejection stunned him into stillness. "What happens," she pressed on, her voice gaining a sharp, painful edge, "when the sculpture is finished? When you don't need a model anymore? What happens to us then, Julian?" The question landed in the silent studio with the force of a physical blow. It was the one question he had deliberately, assiduously avoided asking himself. "What do you mean?" he stammered, a weak evasion. "We'll continue. This isn't about the sculpture, you know that." "Do I?" she challenged, a bitter laugh escaping her. "Sometimes I feel like I am that sculpture, something you are shaping for your own satisfaction, something to admire, to pour your passion into. And when you're done, you'll put me on a pedestal and walk away." The accusation was raw, and it struck a nerve of truth he couldn't deny. "That's not fair, Isa, isn't it?" she cried, her composure finally breaking. "I have dismantled my life for you. My relationship with Mark is a ghost. My friendships are a web of lies. I live in a state of constant, sickening fear, and I need to know that it is for something more than this. This beautiful, tragic bubble that I know is going to burst. Are you ever going to leave her? Do you see a future for us, for me, that exists outside these four walls?" She was pleading with him now, her eyes shimmering with unshed tears, begging him for a promise, a hope, anything to hold on to. And Julian looked at her, at this brilliant, passionate woman who had reawakened his soul, and he had nothing to give her. The idea of leaving Eleanor, of dismantling his own carefully constructed life, was an abstraction, a terrifying, unimaginable cataclysm. He had never allowed himself to think that far ahead. Their affair was a separate reality, a stolen world. He had never considered what would happen if one world tried to consume the other. His silence was her answer. It was a terrible, damning void that confirmed her deepest fears. A single tear traced a path down her cheek. "I see," she whispered, her voice hollowed out. "I'm just a part of your art, after all." She turned then and walked out of the studio, her footsteps echoing in the cavernous space, leaving Julian alone with her question, her accusation, and her perfect, silent, bronze replica. He drove home in a daze, Isa's words replaying in his mind, a torturous loop of his own failure. The quiet, ordered life he was returning to felt like a mockery, a stage set for a play he no longer knew the lines to. He walked into his house, expecting the usual quiet routine, the comfortable silence he shared with Eleanor. But she was waiting for him. She wasn't in the living room. She was in his private study, sitting in the leather armchair he favored, a book lying open but unread in her lap. The lamp beside her cast a severe, focused light, throwing her sharp, intelligent features into relief. An air of immense, calculated stillness emanated from her, and a cold dread, entirely different from the panic he'd felt with Albright, washed over him. This was not a random encounter. This was an ambush. "Eleanor," he said, his voice unsteady, "you're up late." She didn't respond immediately. She simply looked at him, her gaze level and unnervingly calm. "I went to see the sculpture today," she said, her voice cool and precise, devoid of emotion. "The dean of the arts faculty asked me to accompany him. A private viewing." Julian felt a muscle in his jaw twitch. "Oh? And what did you think?" he asked, trying to keep his tone light. "I thought," she said, closing the book with a soft, final thud, "that it is a masterpiece. Without question, the finest work you have ever produced. It's astonishing." He felt a momentary, idiotic surge of pride, a reflex from his old life. "Thank you," he said. "Don't thank me," she continued, her voice dropping slightly, acquiring a steely edge. "I was merely analyzing it, as a piece of art, and as a document." "A document?" "Yes," she said, her eyes never leaving his. "It documents a very specific kind of passion, a desperate, consuming, reckless passion, a feeling that has been absent from your work for a very long time." She paused, letting the words hang in the silent room. "You've done more than capture her likeness, Julian. You've sculpted the affair itself. It's all there, in the turn of her head, the tension in her hands, that expression of longing and sorrow. It's a monument to your infidelity." He was speechless, utterly paralyzed. She had no proof, no photographs, no texts. She had only the truth, which she had dissected with the cold, brutal precision of a historian. He opened his mouth to deny it, to lie, but no words came out. The lie died before it could be born, useless in the face of her absolute certainty. "She's very beautiful," Eleanor continued, her voice still unnervingly calm, as if she were discussing a theorem. "The student, isn't it? The one you hired as a model, Isabella Rossi. I imagine she feels very special, being the muse for such a magnificent work. Does she have any idea that the prize for her passion will be to have her soul, her sin, put on permanent public display for every student, every colleague, for me, to analyze for years to come? It's a rather cruel sort of immortality you've given her." The word cruel struck him like a physical blow. He finally found his voice, a pathetic rasp. "Eleanor, I..." She raised a hand, silencing him. "Do not," she said, her voice now dangerously soft. "Insult my intelligence by trying to lie. Not now. I am your wife. I am not a fool." She stood up then, all calm, collected grace. "We will, of course, maintain appearances. The semester is almost over. You have your reputation and I have my dignity, but when it is done, you will need to make a choice. You cannot live in your studio and live here too. You cannot have your art and your life, because it's clear they are no longer the same thing." And with that, she walked out of the study, leaving him standing there, utterly exposed, a man flayed by the quiet, merciless truth. The emotional weight of his choices, which he had so skillfully dodged for months, had finally crashed down, leaving him broken in the ruins of both his worlds. The days that followed were a masterclass in silence. At home, Julian moved through a cold, frictionless void. Eleanor was a ghost in their house, her presence marked only by the scent of her perfume on a pillow, a half-empty coffee cup in the sink. They were two planets that had slipped from their orbits, moving in the same space but never connecting, their shared life a universe of dead air. The silence from Isabella, however, was a different entity entirely. It was not a void, it was a weight, a heavy, suffocating pressure on his chest. Every moment his phone did not chime with her name was a fresh torment. He was suspended in a state of pure, agonizing paralysis, trapped in the wreckage of two worlds he had single-handedly destroyed. He could bear the Cold War with Eleanor, a conflict waged with the familiar weapons of unspoken resentments, but the silence from Isa was an erasure, a negation of the most vivid, vital experience of his life. He couldn't let it end like that, in a whisper of accusation and a void of nothingness. After 2 days of this hell, he broke. He sent a text, his fingers clumsy, the words stark and pathetic on the small screen. "Studio, tonight. Please." She came. He hadn't been sure she would. When the heavy door creaked open, she looked like a stranger, or rather a pale, tired version of the vibrant woman he had etched into his memory. The fire in her eyes had been banked, leaving behind a dull, smoky ember of sorrow. They stood at opposite ends of the studio, the space between them a chasm littered with the debris of their affair, and in the center, on its pedestal, stood the sculpture. It was finished. It was perfect. A breathtakingly beautiful woman caught in a moment of sublime, sorrowful longing. It was Isa, but an Isa that no longer existed, an idealized ghost cast in cold, unforgiving bronze. The statue was a testament to the passion that had created it, and now, in this funereal silence, it felt like a tombstone. Words were useless, inadequate. What could he possibly say? "I'm sorry I broke you. I'm sorry I cannot give you the one thing you asked for." He took a step towards her, then another. When he was finally in front of her, he saw the deep, weary pain in her eyes, and it mirrored his own. There were no more lies to tell, no more secrets to hide. All that was left was the raw, gaping wound. He didn't speak. He reached for her, his hands closing on her arms, not with tenderness, not with passion, but with a desperate, frantic grip, the grip of a drowning man. It was a raw, primal gesture, a wordless plea not to be abandoned in the ruins. He half expected her to pull away, to finally reject him, but she didn't. She sagged against him, a deep, shuddering sigh escaping her lips. It was not a sigh of desire, but of utter, soul-deep exhaustion. It was a surrender not to him, but to the tragic, inevitable end. He kissed her then. A brutal, clumsy kiss that had nothing to do with love and everything to do with rage and grief and a savage refusal to let go. It was a kiss of erasure, an attempt to blot out the last few days of silence and confrontation with the familiar violence of their physical connection. She kissed him back with a similar desperation, her fingers digging into his back, a silent, shared acknowledgement that this was the only language they had left. This was their goodbye. He led her to the dusty canvas tarp on the floor, the site of their first ecstatic transgression. The magic of that first encounter was a distant, mocking echo. There was no sense of discovery now, only a painful, brutal familiarity. Their final act of love was a desperate, sorrowful thing. It was a dark mirror, a twisted reflection of their beginning. Where their first time had been a slow, reverent unwrapping, a sacred discovery, this was a tearing away of clothes, a frantic, almost punishing need to get to the skin, to the friction, to the oblivion of the act itself. It was fast and rough and profoundly sad. He moved with a possessive, desperate force, trying to physically reclaim what he had already emotionally lost. And she met his desperation with a kind of tragic passivity, her body allowing the intrusion, her mind a million miles away. There were no soft moans of pleasure, only the harsh sound of their breathing, the squeak and rustle of their bodies on the canvas, sounds that were mechanical, empty. Over her shoulder, as he moved, Julian's eyes locked on the finished sculpture. Its bronze face was serene, its pose elegant, its emotional depth undeniable. It was the greatest work of his life, and it was a lie. He had captured the passion but had murdered the source. He had immortalized the feeling but had destroyed the woman who gave it to him. The statue was no longer a monument to his muse. It was a monument to his own spectacular, selfish ruin. He was an artist who had devoured his own inspiration. The realization in that moment was so profound, so devastating that the physical release when it came was not one of pleasure but of pure, unadulterated despair. It was a hollow, empty spasm that brought no relief, only a colder, deeper emptiness. In the immediate aftermath, they pulled apart quickly, the contact that had once been their only solace now suddenly unbearable. The air grew thick, with a miserable, suffocating silence. They scrambled for their clothes, each of them pointedly avoiding the other's gaze, two strangers who knew the most intimate secrets of each other's bodies. The act, which was meant to be a final, binding connection, had only served to underscore the vast, unbridgeable chasm that now lay between them. She was the first to speak, her voice flat, devoid of all its previous warmth. She was dressed, standing by the door, her hand on the knob. "It's finished, Julian," she said. And she wasn't looking at him. She was looking at the statue, the sculpture. It's magnificent. She paused, then finally turned her eyes to him, and what he saw there broke what was left of his heart. There was no anger, no love, no passion. There was only a vast, empty expanse of loss. "And so are we," she finished. He had no words, no arguments, no pleas left. He had used them all up. He could only nod, a single, jerky movement. He watched her open the door, watched her walk out into the corridor without a backward glance, and watched as the heavy door swung shut, the final, definitive sound of their ending. He was alone, utterly and completely alone. He walked, as if in a trance, over to the sculpture, to the perfect, beautiful thing he had created. He raised a trembling hand and laid it on the cold bronze cheek. The metal was lifeless, unyielding. It offered no warmth, no response, no forgiveness. It was just art. And in the terrible, echoing silence of his studio, Julian Vance finally understood the price of his masterpiece. He had traded a living, breathing soul for a beautiful, empty shell. The unraveling, once it began, was swift and silent. Isabella Rossi did not cause a scene. She did not send a final, furious text or make a tearful, desperate phone call. She simply vanished. Julian heard the news in fragments, in the hushed, gossipy tones of the university corridors. She had withdrawn from her doctoral program, citing vague personal reasons. A month later, he overheard a colleague mention that her engagement had been abruptly called off. She had packed her bags, left the quiet suburban town, and evaporated from his world as completely as a morning mist burning off in the Sunday. She left behind only a ghost, a beautiful, sad-eyed wraith that haunted his waking moments, and a perfect, cold bronze replica of herself that would haunt him for the rest of his days. His life with Eleanor settled into a new glacial rhythm. It was a marriage of extreme, chilling politeness. They were two impeccably mannered strangers cohabiting a beautiful house. They discussed current events over breakfast, critiqued faculty papers in the evening, and slept in the same bed with a continent of cold linen between them. There were no more accusations, no more confrontations. The truth had been spoken once, and its terrible power had obliterated any need for further conversation. Eleanor had won, in a sense. She had maintained the facade of her marriage, the dignity of her position, but she was the warden of a prison in which her husband was the sole, self-condemned inmate, a man whose body was present but whose soul was clearly, irrevocably, somewhere else. The sculpture, which Julian had titled Elegy for a Muse, was an immediate, resounding success. The university unveiled it to rapturous applause. Critics wrote glowing reviews, using words like masterpiece, breathtaking, and a return to form. It won a prestigious national award, and the art world once again hailed Julian Vance as one of the great figurative sculptors of his generation. He attended the receptions, he smiled for the cameras, he graciously accepted the handshakes and the accolades. He spoke, in a low, practiced monotone, about the dialogue between classical form and modern emotion, about the challenges of capturing a fleeting moment in a permanent medium. But it was all a performance. As he stood in a tuxedo in a brightly lit gallery, surrounded by admirers, He would look at the statue of Isabella, and what he felt was not pride, but a profound and nauseating shame. The world was applauding the beautiful, shimmering skin of a fruit he knew was poisoned to its very core. They were celebrating the art, but he alone was condemned to know the terrible, human cost of its creation. The applause was like the rattling of chains, each award another bar on the cage of his success. His triumph was hollow, a gilded monument to his own profound and irreversible failure. Months bled into a year. The seasons turned. He tried to work, to start something new, but the studio felt like a tomb. The clay felt cold and dead beneath his hands. The fire Isabella had ignited in him had been extinguished, leaving behind nothing but cold, gray ash. He had created his masterpiece, and it seemed, in the process, he had used up the very last of his creative soul. One night, unable to sleep, he found himself back in the studio, drawn there by an impulse he no longer fought. The room was dark, save for a single brilliant shaft of moonlight that fell from the high skylight, illuminating the sculpture as if it were on a stage. It looked impossibly beautiful, impossibly alive in the silver light. He could almost imagine her breathing. He walked towards it, his footsteps echoing in the vast silent space. He stood before it, this perfect thing born of his flawed, desperate heart. He remembered everything. He remembered the fire in her eyes when she spoke of Bernini. He remembered the taste of her lips, the sound of her breathless protests turning into pleas. He remembered the warmth of her skin under his hands, the living, breathing, pulsing reality of her in his arms. With a trembling hand, he reached out. He had to know. He had to feel it one more time. His fingers, the same fingers that had traced the living, breathing curve of her spine, that had tangled in the silk of her hair, came to rest on the statue's cheek. The bronze was brutally, shockingly cold. It was a cold that seemed to leach the warmth from his own body, a dead, permanent cold that spoke of finality, of absence. It was hard, smooth, and unyielding. It offered no comfort, no recognition, no forgiveness. It was a perfect, beautiful, and utterly empty shell. In that single, terrible moment of contact, the full weight of his choice, of his profound and tragic mistake, crashed down upon him. He had been given a gift, a living, breathing, chaotic, and beautiful human soul who had offered him a chance to feel alive again. And he, in his artistic vanity, in his selfish hunger, had not loved it. He had consumed it. He had rendered it down, extracted its essence, and cast it into a cold, immutable, and ultimately lifeless form. He had traded the woman for the monument. He had traded the fleeting warmth of life for the permanent chill of art. He was Julian Vance, the celebrated artist, a man who had achieved immortality for his creation. And he was utterly, completely, and forever alone, haunted by the ghost of the muse he had destroyed. He was left with only the masterpiece, and the quiet, echoing, unanswerable question that would whisper in the silence of his studio for all the nights of his life. Was it worth the price?